While the village slept under a heavy blanket of dark sky, a soft whimper cut through the quiet, almost too faint to hear. Someone had left a baby at Ruth's doorstep. Ruth, the widow everyone had long forgotten, had lived quietly among the dust and whispers of the village, her days marked by chores, prayer, and solitude. That night, the soft cry shook her out of the rhythm of her life. Rain had left the basket damp, the small cloth inside muddied, and yet the tiny pulse of life could not be ignored. She did not hesitate. Where the world saw a burden, she saw a son. Ruth lifted him gently, feeling the warmth of life still clinging to the small body. The child's fingers clutched her hand weakly, and the little medallion tied around his neck shimmered faintly in the dim lamplight. She named him Tito, and from that moment he became hers. Not by blood, but by the unspoken law of love that chooses to embrace when others turn away. Ruth raised him with everything she had, though it was not much. The house was simple, the food sparse. Yet her arms were always open, her attention unwavering. For 12 years they lived in this small bubble of love, shielding one another from the cold judgment of the village. The neighbors whispered, cast sideways glances, and watched from a distance. Children were taught to avoid him. Mothers' voices called him away when he came near, and doors closed subtly but firmly whenever Ruth passed. None of this stopped her. She would serve him the biggest portion of food, wash his clothes with extra care, and spend long hours sitting beside him, telling him stories about a world where kindness mattered more than bloodlines. Even as Tito grew, the village's quiet cruelty never waned. They didn't call him by name. They waved him off, like a stray dog, as if the very sight of him was a sin. Ruth learned to endure the murmurs. The comments meant not to shout, but to slice silently. "Who raises another person's child without reward?" they whispered. "You never know what she's after." She could have explained, defended herself, or told them he was not hers by birth. She chose silence. Her love did not need justification, and in that quiet defiance, she strengthened both him and herself. Ruth knew the prejudice wasn't just aimed at Tito. It was aimed at her, a widow with no family nearby, a woman daring to care when the world refused. That was scandalous enough. People measured her with pity, judgment, and cold indifference. They scrutinized Tito, looking for signs he did not belong, for flaws that might prove their suspicions true. But Ruth kept standing. She bore each glance, each whisper, as one carries scars, not to relive the pain, but to remember that even wounded she would endure. At night, after Tito had fallen asleep, Ruth would stand at the doorway, looking at him in the dim light of the moon. She imagined the man he might become, and prayed silently that he would grow without the bitterness that had tainted so many lives in their village. She held the little medallion in her fingers, tracing the smooth metal with reverent care, whispering, "Lord, may he never learn to hate." The fear of prejudice she knew was bitter, but hatred, she understood, was a slow poison. And so, even reminded daily that this boy was not her blood, she loved him as fiercely as if he were. Every meal, every piece of laundry, every sleepless night spoke without words. He was hers, chosen by destiny. One humid summer, the rain arrived with early clouds and oppressive heat clinging to the air. Tito, now 3, fell ill. His face glowed with fever, his little body burned under Ruth's hand, and he shivered as sleep eluded him. Simple teas and prayers, which had sufficed before, now seemed powerless. She felt his tiny hand, so hot and weak, and realized that this was not a common fever. There was no husband to fetch medicine, no relatives to turn to. With worn sandals on her feet and desperation in her heart, Ruth set out into the growing storm. She went first to an elder, a woman skilled in the ways of herbs and midwifery. Ruth knocked and called, but the gaze that greeted her was cold and wary. "Is he your son?" the woman asked, as if her answer would decide whether Ruth was worthy of help. Not by blood, Ruth replied, but I raise him. The door shut before any offer could be made. She visited another house, searching for eucalyptus leaves, anything to ease the fever, and was met with the same dismissive glances. Not your son, not your problem, they said. Each refusal pressed like wet stones on her shoulders. The storm outside mirrored the tempest in her heart. Back home, Tito murmured in delirium. Ruth knelt beside him, pressing damp cloths to his burning forehead. She fed him spoonful by spoonful from what little she had, coaxing him to drink and breathe. The rain drummed against the roof, the world outside indifferent to the struggle within. Midnight passed in a haze of whispered prayers, lullabies half song, half plea. Sleep, little one, she murmured. The angel is near. Each word, each motion, was a tether holding him to life. The light of the oil lamp flickered, casting shadows on the walls, and the medallion around his neck swayed gently, keeping pace with her heartbeat. The second night stretched long and heavy. Ruth's body ached, her eyes burned with exhaustion, but she could not leave his side. She replaced the damp cloths, tended to his fever, and sang to him softly, coaxing sleep in broken waves. No one knocked. No one asked if they needed help. The village, usually eager for gossip, was silent, leaving her to care in solitude. On the third night, relief came quietly. Tito's fever began to break. His breath slowed, his flushed face softened, and for the first time in 3 days, Ruth could feel warmth spreading through her, spreading from her heart to her very bones. She leaned her forehead against his, and the tension, the fear, and the exhaustion melted. A tired smile broke across her face, fragile but whole. She looked up at the ceiling and whispered, "Thank you, Lord." There was no audience for that moment, no witnesses to her silent victory. The next morning, she opened the door to the timid son returning after the rain. She washed the cloths, swept the house, and made a thin broth for Tito to regain his strength. Watching him eat slowly, holding the spoon clumsily, she knew all the exhaustion had been worth it. The world might not consider that boy hers. But Ruth knew she had fought the fever the way only a mother would, and so between abandonment and care, between rejection and persistence, another invisible root grew between them. It didn't matter what people said. No one could ever again say Tito was alone. As long as Ruth had breath to sing and hands to care, he would have sheltered. The sun that afternoon was setting lazily, casting a yellow light over the hard-packed earth of the yard. Tito, with his skinny knees and bare feet, was running after a piece of wood he pretended was a toy car. His laughter sliced through the air, light as if, for a few moments, he had forgotten the world that looked at him sideways. Ruth sat on the doorstep, mending a worn-out shirt, watching each step, each stumble, like someone guarding the rarest treasure they have. It was during one of those careless spins that the inevitable happened. Tito tripped over a root and fell to his knees, dragging his thin skin against the rough ground. The crying came quickly, hot and honest, more from fright than pain. But in the middle of those childish sobs, a word escaped, almost shouted, "Mom, help me." The needle stopped mid-air. Time seemed to take a step back. Mom, it was the first time she had heard that word, and it didn't come out as play or imitation. It came loaded with need, with absolute trust. Ruth stood up, her legs trembling, not from effort, but from the sweet weight of that word. She walked over, knelt down, and saw the thin blood trickling down his knee. She didn't respond right away. She didn't say, "That's me," or "You're right." She simply picked him up gently and carried him inside. At the stove, she warmed some water, while Tito still cried, his breathing broken. "We're going to wash this with warm water," she said, her voice low, almost to herself. She cleaned the wound slowly, blew on it to soothe the sting, then wrapped it with a clean cloth, tying it tightly. Inside her, Ruth's heart danced to a rhythm it hadn't known in years. That word, so short and yet so huge, had pierced through time and absence. It was as if the boy had unknowingly opened a door she thought was locked forever. Since her husband had gone and her family had scattered, no one had called her mom in that direct way. And now this word came from a small mouth she loved without being obligated to that she cared for, with no promise of return. No one in the village needed to know. Life had already taught her that the most sacred words are best kept secret because the world tends to ruin what it doesn't understand. So Ruth let that moment stay between the two of them like a jewel kept in the back of a drawer. She went on with the day as usual. Served food, swept the kitchen, hung the laundry on the line. But every time her eyes landed on Tito, a quiet flame lit in her chest. The days that followed went on with the same simplicity. Tito went back to playing and the wound slowly healed, leaving just a thin line on the skin. But for Ruth, that scratch carried more than a scar. It was the mark of Themament he had recognized her. Not for what the world said, but for what he felt, and that she knew no document could prove, and no rumor could erase. That night, when she lay down on her mat, sleep took its time to come. She kept replaying the sound of the word Mom coming from his mouth, repeating it in her mind, like someone trying not to forget the tune. Maybe it was too soon for him to understand the weight of that choice. Maybe he wouldn't even remember later. But for Ruth, that was a silent vow, that in moments of pain and fear, it would be her he'd call. The little metal in the window swayed with the weak wind. The oil lamp made the metal glimmer like a tired but steady star. And Ruth, looking at it, understood that she didn't need a seal, a stamp, or a certificate to belong in that place. She just had to be present. She just had to stay. And staying, that was something she knew how to do like few others. And so through a boy's stumble, a bond was born, stronger than ever. A bond that didn't depend on blood, but on devotion. And even if no one in the village had heard it, Ruth knew that one word spoken only once had already grown roots strong enough to last a lifetime. The start of the school year brought new movement to the village. Children ran along the trails. Mothers adjusted school clothes with safety pins. Fathers chatted about the latest news at the general store. The news that spread the fastest was that the school would be receiving a teacher from the city, Rebecca Young, educated with neatly pressed clothes and a serious gaze. She arrived carrying a leather briefcase and a list of demands. To the village, it seemed a sign of change and progress. To Ruth, however, it meant facing yet another closed door. At the first meeting, under the school's simple roof, Rebecca spoke firmly as she shut down her list. Among her demands, she emphasized the need for every student to present a birth certificate. No document, no enrollment, she declared, unaware that her words cut like a sharp knife. Some mothers whispered among themselves. Others nodded in agreement to Ruth. It sounded like a sentence. She didn't have Tito's birth certificate. She didn't even know where he had been born. On the way back home, the boy walked beside her, holding a stick like it was a sword. He asked if he would be going to school like the others. Ruth smiled but said nothing. Inside her, a storm. Memories of the night she found him in the rain. The weight of the cold metal pressed to his chest. The gossip that still echoed through the village. Everything seemed to come together at a single point. The possibility that the world once again would deny Tito his place. That night, while he slept, Ruth stared at the little metal hanging in the window. The weak wind made the metal chime softly. She whispered a prayer, asking for light to find a way. The next day, instead of heading to the fields, she put on her Leicestone dress and tied a scarf around her head. With a cloth bag slung over her shoulder, she took the dirt road toward the county seat. It was more than a 2-hour walk through hills, creeks, and dust. The sun was relentless, but she didn't slow her pace. At the registry office, she felt the weight of the stairs. People who had never seen her now looked her up and down with curiosity. She calmly explained to the clerk that she needed a temporary document to enroll the boy. He asked for his full name, date of birth, parentage. She gave approximate dates, used her own last name, and said firmly, "If the world won't give him a name, I'll give him mine." She walked out with a simple piece of paper, but for Ruth, it carried the weight of a deed. She folded it carefully and tucked it into her dress pocket as if it were gold. On the way back, her body was tired, but her heart was light. Now Tito had the right to be where the other children were, the right to learn, to read, to write his own name, to be part of the world. On enrollment day, Rebecca looked at the document, then at Ruth. Maybe she understood that the paper had cost more than it seemed. Maybe she didn't, but she stamped it and signed without question. Tito, unaware of the drama, smiled as he watched the other students. On the way out, some mothers whispered, "She did everything just to get that boy into school." The tone varied somewhere between judgment and admiration. Ruth didn't kill Tito's hand tightly, and in the walk home, said only, "Now your name's on the list, and no one can take it away." The village would keep watching, ready to judge their every move. But that day, at least, Ruth felt like she had won a battle. And as always, she did it quietly, without expecting recognition, only with the silent certainty of someone who knows the value of persistence. Time had moved forward like someone walking without hurry, but never stopping. Teta was no longer the boy with scraped knees and uncertain steps. At 12 years old, he was growing fast, his shoulders beginning to broaden, his gaze steady, like someone who already knew the weight of the world, even if he didn't yet understand all its reasons. Life followed the rhythm of the village, days of working the fields, nights lit by oil lamps, and the soft chime of the metal in the window. It was one late afternoon, just as the sun began to lie down behind the mountains, that something different happened. The dirt road kicked up dust beneath the hooves of horses and the creaking wheels of an elegant carriage. In front, a man in fine clothing, Edward, stepped down, adjusting his hat and tailored coat, the kind of clothes no one in that village wore. His walk was confident, his gaze alert, like someone searching for something they're not sure they want to find. The village, curious, as ever, paused to watch. Children crowded at the roadside. Women peeked from behind their doors, and the men pretended to keep working while watching the visitors' every step. Edward passed by the well where Tito was helping fill buckets for the neighbors. When their eyes met, something strange happened. The stranger stopped. He stared at the boy as if the world around him had vanished. His face lost its color, and for a moment it seemed he was about to say something, but he swallowed the words. Tito, confused, looked away and continued filling the buckets. But when Edward passed him again, returning from the store, that same intense gaze returned. This time there was no doubt. The man had seen something he couldn't ignore. By nightfall, Ruth was in the kitchen preparing dinner when they heard firm knocks at the door. She opened it and came face to face with Edward. He took off his hat, revealing hair already touched by time, and asked to come in. His expression wasn't that of someone coming for business or directions. It carried memories and something else Ruth couldn't quite name. Maybe guilt, maybe regret. They sat at the simple table, the oil lamp casting shadows on the walls, after a silence that felt too long. He asked about the boy. Ruth replied that Tito was in the backyard. Edward took a deep breath like someone preparing to cross a dangerous river and said, "I saw that boy today, and I need to know how did he end up here." Ruth didn't answer right away. She simply looked at him, weighing his intentions. Years of weary glances from the village had taught her that not all interest came from a good place. But the tremble in his voice, the way his hands fidgeted on the table told her this conversation was not ordinary. Edward continued, He has a way about him. A look in his eyes, just like someone I once knew, someone I left behind. His eyes, now filled with tears, made it clear the story he carried wasn't light. From the yard, Tito stepped into the kitchen, drawn by the voices. Edward turned to look at the boy more closely, and for a moment was speechless. That expression, the shape of his face, the way he furrowed his brow, it all echoed something he knew too well, something he had perhaps been trying to forget for years. The silence that followed was thick. The visitor lowered his eyes, took a deep breath, and quickly said goodbye, promising to return. Ruth watched him leave, sensing that this wouldn't be the last visit. There was something in the way he looked at Tito, something heavy, something true on the verge of being revealed. That night, she took a long time to fall asleep. Edward's face kept returning to her mind, mingling with the cold gleam of the metal hanging in the window. She had a feeling. Tito's past was about to knock on their door, and when it did, her life would never be the same. The next day dawned overcast with a wind that carried the scent of damp earth. Ruth was in the yard chopping wood for the stove when she heard steady footsteps approaching along the trail. She looked up and saw Edward again. This time, he walked more slowly than the day before, but with the determination of someone who already knew what needed to be said when he got close. He removed his hat and asked to talk. His voice was deep, almost hesitant, as if each word carried weight. They went into the kitchen, and he remained standing for a moment, looking around as if searching for courage among the objects in the room. Finally, he sat at the table, placed both hands flat on the wooden surface, and let the words fall without ceremony. "That boy, he's my son." The silence that followed was heavy. Ruth remained standing, dish towel in hand, trying to grasp the weight of it all. Edward continued, eyes fixed on the floor. "I left him the night he was born. Not out of lack of affection, but out of cowardice. The woman I was with, my mistress, pressured me to choose. I was afraid of my family, afraid of scandal, afraid of losing everything. So I left." The words came out heavy, and the confession seemed to reopen old wounds. He explained that the woman had died months earlier, taken by a sudden illness. In mourning, he began to think again of the baby he had abandoned. He said he had tried for years to forget, but could never erase the image of that child wrapped in cloth. When he saw Tito at the well, he immediately recognized what he had tried to bury in his memory. Ruth listened without interrupting. There was no anger on her face, but there was a quiet wall, the kind that protects everything she had built with Tito. When Edward said he wanted to take the boy with him, to give him a better life, her silence grew even firmer. "He has a life here," she finally said, her voice low but steady. It was at that moment that Tito walked into the kitchen. Drawn by the voices, he looked from one adult to the other, not fully understanding. Edward stood, then knelt before him, eyes filled with tears, and said, "It's me. I'm your father." The boy, confused, looked to Ruth, searching for an anchor. She didn't say a word, just held his gaze the same way she always did in difficult moments. Then Tito spoke without hesitation. "My mother is the one who taught me how to pray." There was no shouting, no crying, just a simple, pure, and final statement. Edward seemed to shrink in front of those words, as if realizing all at once that blood alone was not enough to earn the right to be called father. The conversation didn't last much longer after that. The visitor, realizing he wouldn't get the answer he wanted, stood up, thanked Ruth for the care she had given the boy, and left. From the gate, he looked back one last time, but saw only Tito with his back turned, helping his mother stack the firewood. That night, Ruth felt the weight of the tension, but also the strength of the bond they had built. She knew this wouldn't be the end of the story. Edward seemed determined, and the past she had never gone looking for was now walking straight toward them. But for now there was only the present, and in it she and Tito were still simply mother and son, bound by something no paper, confession, or blood could ever undo. The days following Edward's revelation were like a slow-moving river, calm on the surface, but with stones shifting beneath. Life in the village went on. The Ruers' crow, voices echoing at the well, the thud of pestles pounding corn. But inside the house at the end of the road, there was a new tension invisible to those passing by. Tito seemed quieter. He watched Ruth, as she swept, cooked, or tended the garden, as if searching for answers he wasn't yet brave enough to ask. Edward didn't return right away, but the shadow of his presence seemed to linger over every gesture. And then, one late afternoon, as the sky turned orange, and the chickens searched for shelter, he came back. He arrived unhurried, but with a decided air. He sat at the wooden table, invited only by Ruth's silence. He spoke in a gentler tone than before. He said he wasn't there to tear Tito away by force, only that he wanted to offer him the chance to live in the city, to attend the best schools, to have a better future. Those words, better future, hung in the air like smoke. Ruth knew exactly what he meant. New clothes, a brick house, full plates. But she also knew what that would cost. When he finished speaking, Edward turned to the boy. "If you want to, come with me, son. I'll take you now. You'll have your own room. See new places." Tito, eyes fixed on the ground, didn't answer right away. He was 12 years old, but with a kind of maturity that isn't learned from books. Ruth, who until then hadn't spoken, finally broke the silence. "If you want to go, go with my blessing. But know who stayed by your side through the fevers, the pain, and the days when no one else wanted you." There was no bitterness in her voice, no playa, just the truth spoken like someone placing something in another's hands and trusting they'll know what to do with it. The boy raised his eyes to her, and in that moment, the weight of the choice seemed to dissolve. He stood, walked over to Ruth, and took her hand. "I'm staying," he said, nothing else. He didn't need to. Edward took a deep breath, as if struck by a silent blow. What he summed would be an easy decision after all. Who would turn down a comfortable life had turned into a wall he didn't know how to climb. The wall of love that stays. He stood in silence, for a while, looking at the two of them as if trying to imprint the image into his memory. Then he got up. He didn't argue, didn't press the issue further. He simply said he would return, and walked back down the same path he came. The dust from his steps settled quickly, but the feeling that he would come back remained. That night, mother and son had dinner together like always, a simple meal. The oil lamp lit, the metal swaying in the window with the soft wind. Neither of them mentioned what had happened. They didn't need to. They both knew the choice had not been just about where to live. It was about who to stay with. And even if life would bring more trials ahead, in that moment, the bond between them had deepened. Because some decisions aren't made with the head or the wallet. They're made with the heart, and Tito's heart already knew where it belonged. The silence that lingered after Tito's refusal felt like it had sliced the air in two. For several days, Edward didn't show up. Ruth knew it wasn't the end. A man used to giving orders to getting whatever he wanted with money and influence wouldn't accept a no from a boy so easily. So when he came back, it wasn't a surprise. It was a clear morning with the sound of cicadas echoing through the yard. Ruth was sweeping the porch when she saw in the distance the gleam of the same polished boots kicking up dust on the path. Edward arrived standing tall, more confident, like someone who had come with a plan. He greeted her with a curt nod and got straight to the point. "You know he didn't want to come, but maybe you'll change your mind." Then he pulled an envelope from his pocket and placed it on the table. Inside there was money, far more than Ruth had ever held in her hands. Crisp bills, neatly stacked, smelling like the promise of ease. Edward spoke plainly. "You could live better, have a new house, never need to farm to eat again. All I ask is that you let me take the boy." She looked at the envelope, then at him, and finally toward the doorway, where sunlight poured in, lighting the packed dirt floor. "We grow our food." "Love can't be bought." The words came out firm without anger, but with the certainty of someone who knows the worth of what they have. She pushed the envelope back toward him and went on sweeping as if the conversation was over. Edward stood there unsure how to react. He wasn't used to people turning down money. He watched Ruth for a few seconds as if trying to understand where that strength came from. Then, without another word, he picked up the envelope, slipped it back into his pocket, and left. But he didn't stay gone. A week later, he returned. His posture had changed. There was no more arrogance in his stride. No longer the confidence of someone who believed everything could be solved with numbers. He arrived without shiny boots, dressed in simple clothes. He seemed lighter, or maybe just more tired. Asked to come in, and this time his voice didn't sound like a command. It sounded like a request. He said he'd thought a lot about what Ruth had told him, that he couldn't forget her words about growing food and not buying love. That maybe for the first time in his life, he had understood that not all value could be measured in money. He confessed that after he left, he returned to the city and realized that despite the big house and the plentiful table, there was a kind of emptiness no wealth could fill. Ruth didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She just listened. She didn't want easy promises. She knew true change didn't come from the mouth. It had to come from the soul. Tito, sitting in a corner, watched his father with sharp eyes, as if measuring each gesture to see whether it rang true. Edward said he wasn't there to take the boy. Not anymore. But he wanted to find a way to be part of his life, to give back, to show gratitude for all the years Ruth had raised him alone. He didn't ask for forgiveness in so many words, but the tone in his voice carried regret, and in that moment, Ruth realized that maybe life was finally beginning to work in their favor. The father, who once came as a threat, now seemed like someone willing to learn. And even if there was still a long road ahead before trust could grow, she knew the first step had been taken. Time, which so often had separated destinies, now began to weave invisible bridges. After that conversation, the one where Edward returned without arrogance, the village started to notice subtle changes. He no longer came to talk about taking Tito away. He came to sit on the porch, to listen to the boy's stories, to leave behind a sack of flour or beans, not as payment, but as a gesture. It was one late afternoon, with heavy clouds piling up on the horizon, that Edward arrived with a different air about him. There was no envelope full of money in his hands, no expensive gifts. He came only with a hat on his head, his face more marked by time, and a gaze that was steady yet calm. He sat at that table, waited for Ruth to finish serving the coffee, and before even taking a sip, shared the news. "I want to donate a piece of my land to the village." The words hung in the air, and Ruth, cup in hand, simply raised her eyebrows, waiting for him to explain. "I want them to build a school. A good one, with more classrooms, more books, more teachers. And I want it to bear your name." Ruth's eyes widened, not out of vanity, but because it all seemed too big to fit into her story. Edward, noticing her surprise, went on, "If I can't be a father the way I should have been, then at least I want to show gratitude. What you did for that boy, no one else would have done, and I know there's no way to repay that. But maybe I can turn that gratitude into something that serves everyone." The silence that followed wasn't hesitation. It was the weight of it all. Ruth understood just how much that gesture could change the lives of the village's children. She also knew that coming from him, this wasn't just generosity. It carried regret, a quiet plea for redemption. When the news spread, the whole village stirred. Some received it with admiration, others with suspicion. There were those who said it was just a way to clear his conscience, but even they knew that regardless of the motive, the benefit was real. A larger school meant more opportunities, more teachers, more future for the children. On the day the agreement was signed, Edward insisted that Ruth be present. There was no grand ceremony, just a desk at the registry office, the document, and her name written on paper as patron of the future school. To her, that moment wasn't about honor or personal recognition. It was about seeing Tito's world, and that of so many other children, grow just a bit wider. The land chosen was at a high point where the wind blew freely, and the sun rose unobstructed when they walked there together. Edward said, "Hear the children. We'll learn to read, to write, and maybe to believe they're capable of more than they imagine." Tito, listening, said nothing, but his eyes scanned the place as if already seeing the future being built there. Ruth, in turn, couldn't help but think that the same man who once abandoned his child in the darkness of night was now offering light to many lives. And although the wounds of the past wouldn't close overnight, there was at last the beginning of healing. That night, when she returned home, Ruth hung Tito's medal in the window as she always did. But this time, as she saw it shine under the moonlight, she felt its chime had a different sound. The sound of a story that after so much abandonment was finally beginning to be written with hope. The years passed like a hand over an old wound. They didn't erase the mark, but they let the skin grow stronger. The donated land was slowly transformed brick by brick into a school that seemed almost too big for the village, with white paint walls, wide windows that let the breeze in, and a yard where the noise of children echoed like a promise of the future. The inauguration was simple, without long speeches, but filled with a meaning everyone could feel deep in their chest. Tito, now 18, was no longer the child Ruth had once found wrapped in cold cloth. He was a tall young man with a steady gaze and calm voice, carrying the humility of someone who had known abandonment and the value of being welcomed. He'd had opportunities to continue his studies far away, but chose to stay in the village close to his mother, helping with the garden, caring for the house, and now teaching as an assistant at the new school. At first, he taught the younger children how to hold a pencil, to connect letters, to form words. But little by little, he began teaching more than what was in the books. He showed them how to share bread when there wasn't enough, how to help a neighbor without expecting anything in return, how not to laugh at someone who had less. He knew many of those children carried the same kinds of pain he once had. An absent father, an overwhelmed mother, a home too small for so many dreams. There was one boy in particular who reminded him of himself. He lived with his grandmother, always wearing oversized clothes and carrying a guarded look. Tito never asked about his father or mother. He knew some questions were like reopening wounds that still bled, but in quiet ways he offered his presence, helped with schoolwork, sat beside him during recess, and little by little, the boy began to smile more, and Tito understood once again that to teach is also to stay. Ruth watched it all with a pride that needed no words. In her son she saw an expanded reflection of what she had patiently nurtured. Not just a capable man, but a good one. And she knew that this came not from blood, but from daily coexistence, from the repetition of simple gestures that shape a person's character. In the village, even those who once turned their noses up at the boy with no story had begun to treat him with respect. Some even forgot he'd once been left at a doorstep on a rainy night. To them, Tito was the young teacher at the new school, the one who listened patiently, who explained without rushing, who treated everyone with the same care. One day, in the middle of a reading lesson, a child raised a hand and asked, "Teacher, where did you come from?" The classroom fell silent, eyes fixed on him as if a great mystery was about to be revealed. Tito smiled, looked out the window where he could see in the distance the house at the end of the road, and replied from a woman who didn't need blood to be my mother. He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. The phrase stayed in the minds of those who heard it repeated later by the children as if carrying a teaching more valuable than any lesson written on the chalkboard. When Ruth heard about it, she simply lowered her head, eyes full of tears, and gave thanks in silence for a bond that had withstood time, poverty, prejudice, and even the boy's own biological father. That same day, on his way home, Tito passed by the window and saw the metal still hanging, swaying in the breeze as always. He smiled. He knew that little piece of metal marked the exact place where his life had truly begun. Not the day he was born, but the day he was chosen to stay. Time had shaped that story the way a river shaped stone, with consistency, patience, and inevitability. Ruth, once just the forgotten widow at the edge of the village, was now remembered with respect, not for having amassed wealth, but for having carried an entire life on her shoulders without ever seeking applause. And Tita, once cradled in her arms wrapped in wet cloth with a cold medal around his neck, was now a grown man with deep roots and a clear purpose. Edward, the biological father who had once knocked on that door full of arrogance, was no longer the same. Hess still lived in the city, but found quiet ways to visit, always respectfully, never interfering in the life they had built. The school built on the land he had donated stood as a constant reminder that no matter how wrong past choices had been, there is always a way to repair, at least in part, the damage done. And perhaps that's what gave him some peace, knowing that even if he hadn't been a present father, he had helped open doors for many other children. The village which once looked at the boy with no story with suspicion, now spoke his name with pride. Tito hadn't become rich, hadn't traveled far, hadn't earned titles, but he had gained something more lasting. The respect of those who knew his journey, the affection of the children he taught, and the certainty that he had found his place. Evenings at the house, at the end of the road, remained simple. The oil lamp still lit the kitchen. The stove released the scent of meals cooked without haste, and the metal still hung in the window, chiming softly when the wind passed. It was more than just an object. It was a silent symbol of victory, a reminder that even a story that began with abandonment could end in belonging. The bond between mother and son didn't need a certificate, nor proof. It was written in their gestures, in the way she prepared food, in the stories they shared at dusk, in the comfortable silence that only exists between those who've crossed pain and joy side by side. Tito knew without being told that this love was rare. Ruth knew without needing to hear it that she had fulfilled the purpose handed to her on that rainy night in both their hearts. There was the quiet certainty that life can be hard, unfair, and unforgiving, but that it also allows for moments of silent justice, and in that village no one doubted a simple truth anymore. To be a mother is not to give birth, it is to stay. And so under the soft light of the moon that streamed through the window, the metal gleamed, reflecting not only a past of abandonment, but a present of belonging and a future of continuity. Because for those who've learned to plant love, even in dry soil, every season brings its harvest. And this one, the most important of all, had already been gathered. If this story touched your heart, let us know where you're watching from. Leave a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to the channel. That really helps us keep bringing you real and emotional stories like this one. Thank you for being part of our